to address at least some of the Homeland Security issues, I have a special guest. He is a former Border Patrol agent as well as former council member for the city of Sierra Vista, Arizona. Please welcome Tom Crosby.
It is such a pleasure to be with you, Andy. And, if you've been watching the news, which I'm sure you do, but as our other listeners might know, Mexico is having a lot of unrest with protesters on the border and at the ports of entry. And I've been a proponent for a long time of having the U.S. military on the south side of the border. And I believe that this would be very beneficial for Mexico because it would cut down the amount of violence and I believe would be less prone to corruption than any Mexican law enforcement or Mexican military in the same position on the south side of the border.
Well, one interesting factor is it would also do something about all of those human traffickers as well as the cartels operating on the U.S. and Mexican sides of the border with complete and total impunity.
Right. So it's past time to take that. There's a treaty that the U.S. has with Mexico called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And what it says is the U.S. military will not be on the border. However, it is my view that Mexico is not a sovereign country, and therefore any treaties that we have had with Mexico, assuming Mexico to be a sovereign country, do not apply.
Well, and also something you can attest to in both capacities. We know about the Mexican military incursions, so it's not like the Mexican military has respected the treaty itself. They clearly have ignored that going back, how many decades at least?
Between the Mexican military itself, the militarized cartels, and anybody else that wants to purport themselves to be the military or law enforcement when in fact they are not, represents a tremendous problem for Mexico, for the safety of their citizens and so on. The last time I heard what I thought would be a fairly good statistic, it was 145,000 innocent people that had been killed in cartel violence. And that what that shows to me is a government that is broken down and cannot perform the primary function of a government, which is to protect their own citizens.
Absolutely. Now, moving forward, we also have General Kelly, who has been sworn into his office, and he has a lot of work ahead of him. President Trump, during his campaign, talked about draining the swamp. Well, as I've long reported, the Border Patrol, and we'll just focus on that because that was the agency where you served, is long in need of not just a fix, but a serious overhaul and a major purge, considering that from his time as chief of the Border Patrol, David Aguilar did everything to wreck the Border Patrol, an agency built on honor and tradition, and he destroyed it.
Right. Well, you used the term major purge, and I don't know exactly how far down the food chain that would have to apply, but it would be pretty far. And probably the same thing could be said for the military, although I don't have the background in the military. But if you have people, this is the problem, Andy. Bureaucrats are much worse than politicians. At least with politicians, there is some hope of being able to get rid of them through the election process. Not so with bureaucrats. To the general public, bureaucrats are invisible, and they stay in place for an entire career, and they have tremendous amounts of power to implement policies that come down in the executive branch. So another factor that you have along those lines is when anybody talks about the military on the border. I mean, you get this a lot of times from ex-military members that have a lot of pride in agencies, no matter if it's the Army or the Marines, for instance. Well, if we only had the military on the border, we would solve this problem of the border. But what I always have to remind people of is the Border Patrol and the military both have the same commander-in-chief. So that being president, of course. So whatever policies would be implemented, whether it were de facto amnesty or protection of the border would be implemented either by the Border Patrol or the military because of having the same commander-in-chief. We talked a little bit before this break about the potential of the military on the south side of the border, U.S. military on the south side of the border. And what I pointed out is that the one difference between the Border Patrol and the military is the Border Patrol clearly operates within the boundaries of the U.S. Constitution, where the U.S. military does not. They operate under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So it was designed that way. The military was designed to work in other countries. Another thing I'd like to point out is there are already military personnel and military assets from the United States in Mexico. Therefore, one of the major considerations that I feel needs to be addressed is what other countries have military assets in Mexico. We need to know about that.
Very true. Now, something else you also addressed has to do with the apprehensions numbers that we know are a mess and have been a mess for at least a decade and 13, 14 years at minimum. As bad as things were under Doris Meisner, they clearly began to get worse and have become what it is today under the Department of Homeland Security. Let's address those numbers real fast, because something you said as we did a pre-interview really addressed it, and having been an intel officer for the Border Patrol. Please address that.
Right. Okay, I have this little quip that I use to address this, and it goes like this. I was in the intel office, and I learned how to interpret Border Patrol statistics, and it goes like this. Apprehensions are up. It's working. Apprehensions are down. It's working. So whenever anybody from the Border Patrol or from the government wants to show apprehension numbers, whether they're up or down or good or bad, immediately change the discussion to how many illegal aliens are in the country. Who are they? Where are they? Whose responsibility is it to know? But that's what you always need to change the conversation to whenever anybody wants to talk about apprehension statistics. The other is, what is the definition of an apprehension? For instance, when I was in Spokane, Washington, we would go out and we would give people a walking warrant, like a notice to appear for your immigration hearing, all right? And that was counted. I mean, that's like letting people go. We're actually legalizing them, de facto legalizing these aliens, okay? Do you know what the sector considered that to be? An apprehension. Believe it or not.
You can't make this stuff up, is what I always say.
Yeah, you can't make it up. We really let them go, but the sector counted it as an apprehension. All right? So make sure that you know what the definition of apprehension is from the get-go, or you're just going to fall for a bunch of malarkey.